While we're waiting for this to happen, if you have any questions for Sam, we could do that very quickly. Neil? Excuse me.
Sam, there are plenty of things people do that don't make sense, but of course they're otherwise harmless to others, and might be mildly harmless to the person who thinks it or believes it, but no one makes a big deal of it. If the religious community, instead of going away, morphed into a systems of philosophy that made no attempt to say things about the physical world that are easily verifiable by the methods and tools of science and rational inquiry. And they only simply talked about, how to treat your neighbor, how to, maybe give you someplace to think you might be when you're dead. What's the harm in that? If we're going to try to be realistic about how effective any such movement that you want to support can be, either you're going to say one day there can be no religions in the world, or one day there's a profile of the various religions that have changed to the point where they don't trigger anybody's reaction, anyone such as your reaction.
Right. Well, I'm just not hopeful that they can change. They can be so chaste in their proclamations about reality so as not to conflict with those of us who are trying to speak sensibly about reality and to shape public policy that's based on sensible conversation. So, for instance, what do you do when you find out that your neighbor's religion has proscribed drawing a caricature of a certain historical figure and has prescribed it in such terms that you can get 100,000 people in the town square calling for the deaths of newspaper editors and cartoonists for drawing, for publishing pictures of the Prophet Muhammad? It seems to me that really is a deal breaker. I mean, this is just free speech and rational understandings of civil society just have to win. It's just there's no accommodation with that. What was so scandalous about that episode is that we really caved in. I mean, we practiced self-censorship. We chastised Denmark for publishing those cartoons, and New York Times wrote editorials about it. And we're not recognizing the bigger picture here, which is this is an eruption of medievalism that is sanctioned by the fastest growing religion in the world. And here again, I'm focusing on Islam almost randomly. I mean, I'm worried about religion in totality, but you have to get, if you're going to dignify the claim that one of our books is not just a book, but is in some sense an infallible document, it seems to me, always going to be held hostage to the contents of the book. And it just so happens that these books are engines of intolerance. I mean, 100 years from now, someone can pick up the Quran or the Bible and find reasons to be every bit as obnoxious as Ted Haggard or worse. And those reasons are continually refreshing themselves. So unless we undercut this notion that the Bible and the Quran are not at all like the plays of Shakespeare, I don't think the problem can go away.
Yeah, I'm going to have to be an engine of intolerance because I'm hostage to time. So,
topic.
Well, we've all been in a situation where you make a generalization which is statistically accurate for the majority of the cases that you're referencing. So you might say something like, on average, men are taller than women. Okay, that is a precisely correct statement. But in every crowd, there's going to be someone who says, that's not true. I know a woman who's much taller than men. Well, okay, that person was thinking about your sentence differently from how you actually worded it. And they're living in the exceptions of the generalization that you're making. And it's an interesting, I don't know if that's the cost of an educational system that does not teach probability and statistics, because probability and statistics had to be invented, and it's a relatively modern branch of mathematics. It wasn't much around back in Galileo or Newton or this. We had to, and the fact that it had to be invented and it was invented relatively late must say something about its absence in our capacity to think natively on these topics. And so another one is, if you might say, most water bottles are made of plastic. Just say that, okay? It's a stupid example, but it'll make the point. And then someone says, no, I know about this other bottle that's made of glass. All right? Again, these two statements are not conflicting with one another. But it's because these people are in your audience, it almost forces you to have to say most, but not all, are made of plastic. And most, but not all, you can't get more literarily redundant than that. Yet the language was constructed to handle the people in the audience who are not thinking statistically right alongside your sentence. And so when I heard your conversation on that podcast, you kept making statements about, was it radical? I don't want to misquote you, but the sense of it'll be accurate. Of those who are Muslim, there are those who agree with the most radical sides of it, but won't necessarily act on it. Then there's a subset who might act on it. And that, however small that percent is, that if it's a small percentage of a big number, it's actually a lot of people. And her persistent response throughout your entire podcast was, you can't paint all Muslims into that category. And you're speaking by one another. You were not converging. And so my since you're the host and she's the guest, my quote criticism of you wasn't so much a criticism as an observation. You have to have a conversation in the same universe as the person you're having the conversation with. You can't expect them to come to you. You're the host. You've got to go to them. And if that's how she's thinking about it, your sentences need to be in that world. And they weren't. And so, of course, there was conflict. Of course, she kept having to stop you and say, you're not hearing what I'm saying. She didn't say this explicitly, but she was probably thinking it, you're being a bigot or anti-Muslim or whatever. So I just thought that your tactics of communication, by the way, you're one of the most articulate people I have ever heard speak. All right. You have precise command of words that is uncommon in Americans. You hear it in Oxford orators, but what comes out of you, wow, I think to myself, boy, that was a good use of a word. Wow, that was a sharp, and they're not necessarily big words. They're just sharp use of perfect words in the right moment and in the right place. But you're also highly educated and you have philosophical, what am I trying to say? You have learned thoughts that when placed to a page are best read by other academics. Yet you publish it to the public. And then you cry foul when the public misunderstands what you're saying because there's one sentence that's way more potent than another sentence. And you think they're equal or equal parts, but they're not. They're not received equally. They would be as read by an academic because they're looking at your comment carefully. But to the public, if you say, I can understand, again, if I misquote you, correct me, but my sense will be accurate. I'm paraphrasing you. I can understand why one might choose to torture. I don't agree with it, but I understand why. Well, these are two statements. Now, where are you going there? Well, if I'm anti-Sam Harris, I'm going right to the statement, I can understand why you should torture. And that's my soundbite. So you didn't, in your writing, you did not shape the sentences and the paragraphs for the person who's reading it. And so, in basketball, and in driving, in basketball, if you throw the ball, pass the ball, and the person does not catch it, it's your fault, no matter what. No matter what. Because you're the one passing the ball, and it has to be such that the person has no chance of not catching it. The same with a rear-end collision. If you rear-end somebody, it's your fault. There is no conversation after that. So as writer, as communicator, as articulate as you are, I think you need to share at least half, if not 85%, of the accountability of people misreading what you say.
Yeah, I would agree to that, except obviously I've suffered enough of this and paid attention out of purely self-interest enough to know that some of this is actually consciously malicious, whereas it's not a matter of a misunderstanding. It's a matter of, someone is simply lifting a misleading sentence, a sentence that can't help but be misleading out of context, so as to spread a falsehood about my views. I mean, one really egregious example here is in one of my books, I think it's Letter to a Christian Nation, I was talking about the naturalistic fallacy in moral philosophy, and how you could never say that because something is natural, it is good. And we're not tempted to say that. We're not tempted to say that about rape, for instance. Rape is perfectly natural. Dolphins rape, orangutans rape. Our ancestors may have raped, and that may have produced some evolutionary advantage, some adaptive advantage for them, getting their genes into the next generation. This is still controversial in biology, but let's just say that's so. You would never move from that naturalistic claim to the normative moral claim that rape is therefore good or in any way acceptable. Most of what is natural, we're trying to outgrow, tribal violence being the primary candidate there.
Yeah, but you don't live in a bubble. You know how, again, the dictionary definition is irrelevant here. What matters is how people see, perceive, and hear words. The word natural currently means good. You know this. It's like, take me to the natural food store. Take me to the natural section. That's what it means.
No doubt. But in the context of actually discussing the naturalistic fallacy, right, and talking about how nature doesn't entail moral goodness, my point is that no matter how scrupulous you are, if you're going to write anything deep and interesting and you're going to cover any kind of provocative material, there's no way to bulletproof every sentence against misleading quotation.
Sure. And I'm a little bit Monday morning quarterback here, but here's how I would have done that. I would have made 2 columns. I would have made a table. And one column is natural things that are bad for you. And then another one would be artificial things that are good for you. And then, and then if rape is one of the things that is naturally say, there is rape in these species. There and that is nature. And then it's a table, and then you just look at it's a lookup table, composing whole sentences around it, making arguments for it. And rape is a charged topic, especially with Bill Cosby, that case in the news. You must know this. And so, of course, sorry, Letter to Christian Nation predates that. I get that, but there's you take your charged words and shape them in a way that make them a little more bulletproof from being abused. That's all. And that's the contract you should have with your audience to communicate with them.
Yeah, well, I'm a slow learner, but I think I'm getting better.
I got to pull back.
Yeah, you got to come in. But it is. Let me try and bridge that gap a little bit.
I'm going to be silent.
No, you're not. I think it's really important to point out that this is a political issue, and in fact, me and Buzz Aldrin together testified before the House Science Committee on Space Exploration, and when I said that humans don't do science in space, I didn't argue, in fact, even before the committee, that we shouldn't send humans into space. We should just say honestly why we're doing it. We're doing it for adventure. That's why we're doing it.
No, that's not what funded it.
Hold on.
No, that's not true.
See, you said you wouldn't talk.
I did say.
Okay.
You can say that.
No, hold on.
There's no there. Okay? No. Just look at the history of everybody doing big projects, and it's never driven by exploration. It's never driven by science. It's never driven by curiosity. Not if it's big and expensive. It's driven by the fact that people don't want to die. So there's a war driver. It's also driven by the fact that people want to get wealthy. So
hold on. We have the Large Hadron Collider. The Large Hadron Collider.
Do you know?
Oh, no.
No.
Just proves my point.
The Large Hadron Collider